with co-author James Kwok. He wrote what I think is the best of the books that I've read, and by now I've read quite a few, about the financial crisis. It's called 13 Bankers, the Wall Street Takeover, and the Next Financial Meltdown. Simon is ubiquitous. You can read his articles and see him on television. And of course, his most outstanding characteristic is that he writes for the New Republic. Thank you. Jesse Markham, in the center here, is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco School of Law. He is a leading practitioner as well. He's guided the antitrust departments of Holm, Roberts, and Owen, Morrison and Forster, and Warwick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe. He also wrote a paper on the too big to fail problem not that long ago, and qualifies as an expert on this subject. And Ioannis Kokkoris, right here, is a reader at the University, reader at the University of Reading. Can't I say the University of Reading? In the UK. And he teaches competition law and company law. He wrote a book, co-authored a book recently, published by Cambridge University Press, called Antitrust Law Amidst Financial Crisis. And he's also written about the enforcement of Article 102, but the one on antitrust law and the financial crisis is really so much on point that it makes Ioannis a perfect member of this cast. So, if I can begin, maybe we could ask Simon to give us a brief overview of how the U.S. approached the financial crisis. Thumbnail sketch.
Thanks, Bert. It's a great privilege to be here. I cannot, of course, provide a thumbnail sketch of all the aspects of the financial crisis in the United States and how it was handled. But let me highlight a couple of points that I think are relevant for our discussion. And let me actually not so much provide my own characterization as summarize what Neil Borofsky said in his final report. Neil Borofsky, you may remember, was the Special Inspector General for TARP within the Treasury Department. And he made, I think, a very convincing point that in the fall of 2008, the U.S. authorities, meaning the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, combined with the FDIC and others, acted to save the financial system through providing what I think you could call, somewhat loosely but rather accurately, unconditional bailouts. So financial support was provided that saved not just the firms that were in trouble after the collapse of Lehman and the problems of the AIG. The firms that were in trouble were saved, the management was saved, the boards of directors remained in place, their creditors were protected 100%, and even shareholders, remarkably, and actually quite unusually compared with the situation in almost all other countries that face this kind of crisis, the shareholders were also protected. They were not wiped out. The companies were not put through any kind of FDIC-type resolution process, which certainly had been the standard way of dealing with bank failures in the United States to that point. Now, unconditional bailouts were provided, and Borofsky makes the argument that perhaps that's what you had to do, given the severity of the circumstances. He also points out that this reinforced absolutely whatever moral hazard you think there was in the system prior to the financial crisis was surely confirmed, reinforced, made stronger by the actions of the government, because they showed at this moment of severe crisis they wouldn't take any action that would hurt, in particular, creditors of these very big banks. And Borofsky went further, and this is really counts as inflammatory fighting language within official Washington. I think this is why he's no longer at the Treasury, in part, although I can't speak to cause and effect there. He said that what these bailouts had done is effectively created a new set of government-sponsored enterprises, a new kind of financial institution similar to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the sense that they had implicit government guarantees. And whatever you think about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and I personally don't think they were the central cause of the crisis, there's no question that they had too much political power, too little capital, they were badly managed, they took on far too much risk, and they blew themselves up at great cost to the American taxpayer. But Borowski says the new Fannie and Freddie are the private banks that are now seen as too big to fail, because they have the implicit government guarantee. They have the ability to borrow cheaper. They can become bigger, hence the antitrust issues perhaps can be discussed, although I think that turns out not to get us very far. We'll see. The banks, the biggest banks, the largest 6 bank holding companies in the United States are now larger than they were before the crisis. If you look at them relative to GDP, they're about 60, their total balance sheets about 63% of GDP. They were more like 56 to 58% of GDP before the crisis. Go back to the mid-1990s, those same bank holding companies and the companies that they were built around were 17% of GDP. So the big banks have become a lot bigger, and the actions of the government in the crisis, perhaps necessary actions, but definitely I think it's uncontroversial, the consequence of these actions was to make these banks bigger, I would argue more powerful politically, better able to draw on implicit government support, and the attempts to reform them and rein them in, which we can go through in as much detail as you want, including the Dodd-Frank financial reform legislation, I think has had very little impact. And just to finally, I attended the FDIC, the first meeting of the FDIC Systemic Resolution Advisory Committee on Tuesday.
Was that public?
Yes, it's a public hearing, and I can share with you all the things that were said on camera. And I have to say, just my own personal impression from those conversations, public and private, is that nothing will be done. And in fact, I asked the question, and I'll ask the same question here. I asked the question, because they were talking about what would be done if big banks were to fail. If a big $2 trillion bank, the biggest banks are $2 trillion, $2.5 trillion in balance sheet in the US today. If one of these banks were to fail, the FDIC staff were discussing the pros and cons of letting that bank be bought by another bank, or having some part of it be bought or acquired, perhaps even with a government subsidy to acquire. And I asked the question, who thinks that having a $2 trillion bank be bought by another $2 trillion bank could possibly be a good idea from the perspective of systemic risk, which is the responsibility of that committee. Antitrust is a different matter, which we'll talk about today.
Can a bank like that be broken up into pieces and sold to a variety of smaller banks?
Yes, you can do, I think you could have done a lot of this before, frankly, but certainly under the Dodd-Frank Act, under Title II of that act, as interpreted by the FDIC, and they explain this in public, on camera, at this committee meeting, they can take a lot of different kinds of actions that would include breaking up the bank. But the problem, Bert, is that when you're in a crisis, when every minute matters, you have 6 hours until the Tokyo market opens. You have to take an action. You generally, all the other concerns you have, including antitrust, but also other issues of, is this the least cost way to do it? Is this jeopardizing some other dimension of the public interest? All of those things will generally be pushed to the side, because you've got to get the deal done in 6 hours.
Yeah. Okay, we'll get into some of that as we go along. Let me ask Jesse, the United States has 2 primary potentials for influencing competition issues in this kind of context. One is Federal Reserve itself, and the other is the Justice Department Antitrust Division. Can you give us a sense of what those possibilities are and maybe what happened?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of things to note about that. One of the reasons that you pointed to the Fed, and there are actually 4 banking agencies that under different circumstances could review a bank consolidation or combination. I don't think this is on. Is this on? It is.
You weren't very close.
I wasn't.